The primary blast doors of Sector 4 did not simply close. They engaged with a brutal, mechanized finality that rattled the kinetic dampeners buried deep within the deck plating of Station Kronos 9. Here, in the belly of the Galactic Military Institute, the air itself tasted different, a sharp, metallic blend of ozone, sterilized combat stimulants, and the unmistakable, cold copper scent of freshly spilled blood. For 43 cycles, I have walked these crimson-striped corridors. My name is Thora Kryn, Senior Combat Instructor, and I have dedicated my life to forging the galaxy's most elite, lethal assets. I teach tactical warfare to species that are born with weapons integrated into their physiology. I have seen Tholian heavies break under the psychological weight of the isolation chambers. I have watched hardened Corran veterans snap during the zero-gravity breach simulations, their minds fracturing before their bodies did. In a facility where the mortality rate during basic training hovers comfortably around 12%, survival is not a guarantee. It is a continuously expiring contract. To exist in Trauma Response Unit 7 is to exist in a perpetual state of hypervigilance. Which is why the first thing I noticed about the human was her complete and utter lack of appropriate fear. She stood in the center of the staging corridor, directly in front of the reinforced, blast-scarred titanium doors of the active combat bay. She was impossibly small. By my estimation, the human female stood barely 5 feet tall. Her physiological framework appeared fragile, lacking any visible dermal armor, exoplating, or redundant respiratory vents. She clutched a worn, obsolete data pad against her chest like a physical shield, her head tilted back as she stared up at the towering blast doors. And she was smiling. It was an expression of cheerful curiosity, fundamentally incompatible with a space that had claimed 3 lives just the cycle before. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was bright, melodious, and entirely too pleasant. It echoed off the blast-shielded walls, cutting through the low-frequency hum of the station's plasma reactors. I stopped in my tracks. The microservos in my combat harness whined as I shifted my weight, my combat instincts momentarily stalling. "Is this Advanced Xenobiology 301?" she asked, her eyes finding mine. I stared at her. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of the question short-circuited my higher reasoning centers. Deep within my neuro-optical network, a primal, involuntary response triggered. My secondary eyes blinked independently from my primary ones. It is an evolutionary leftover, a physiological glitch my species exhibits only when confronted with something so fundamentally impossible that our brains require immediate, secondary visual confirmation just to ensure we are not hallucinating. She was not a hallucination. She was a biological anomaly standing in the kill zone. "No," I said slowly. I forced my tone into the low, carefully modulated register I use for diffusing unexploded ordnance. My mandibles clicked together with barely suppressed disbelief, the sharp sound bouncing off the titanium walls. "This is Trauma Response Unit 7, military combat training for soldiers." I expected the blood to drain from her soft, unarmored face. I expected the immediate physiological markers of panic, dilated pupils, erratic respiration, the sudden realization that she was standing in the galaxy's most efficient meat grinder. Instead, she glanced down at her data pad. Her small digits swiped through a few glowing screens, her brow furrowing in mild, domestic annoyance rather than existential dread. Then, she looked back up at me with a smile that could only be described as catastrophically optimistic. "Oh, my mistake," she chirped, the tone of someone who had simply misread a transit schedule. "I must have taken a wrong turn after the cafeteria. These stations are so confusing, aren't they?" My primary eyes narrowed. The lack of situational awareness was staggering. "All the corridors look the same," she offered, waving her hand vaguely at the monolithic, war-torn architectures surrounding us. "They are color-coded," I informed her. I raised one of my upper forearms, gesturing sharply toward the thick, crimson warning stripes running along the junction lines of every wall, floor, and ceiling surface. "Red means military zone. Unauthorized personnel will be detained or eliminated depending on threat assessment. I let the word eliminated hang in the sterile air. It was not a threat. It was a statement of automated station policy. Right, she nodded agreeably. Her posture did not shift into a defensive crouch. Her heart rate, which I could faintly hear pulsing in her fragile throat, did not spike. She reacted as if I had just politely explained the location of the nearest restroom, rather than clearly outlining her potential imminent execution by automated security drones. "Well, sorry to bother you," she said brightly. "I'll just—" She turned to leave, but the universe, in its infinite malice, had other plans. That was the precise moment the primary airlock of Trauma Response Unit 7 cycled open, venting a pressurized cloud of synthetic battle smoke and superheated air into the corridor. Kraragtha emerged from the training bay. The floor plating physically vibrated under his mass. Kraragtha is a Vexian shock trooper. He is 8 feet of dense, hyperoxygenated muscle and chitinous armor plating, possessing a jaw structure that can literally crush steel framing. His species evolved on a death world where the flora is just as likely to disembowel you as the fauna. His temperament makes highly territorial apex predators seem friendly by comparison. Right now, he was a living nightmare. He was covered head to claw in viscous training gel, his armor glowing with the green artificial blood of simulated near-fatal wounds. The simulation had pushed him into what we in the military politely refer to as a heightened state of aggressive readiness. In layman's terms, he was drowning in a cocktail of combat stimulants and adrenaline, and he was desperately looking for something to hit. The heavy pneumatics of the door hissed into silence. The smoke cleared just enough to reveal the corridor. Kraragtha saw the human. His predatory brain processed her presence instantly, an unrecognized, unarmored biological entity standing inside a restricted military kill zone. His deeply ingrained combat protocols activated without a millisecond of hesitation. The heavy, interlocking plates of his crest flared a vibrant, aggressive red. From his primary forearms, razor-sharp fighting claws extended with a sickening snap of bone and metal. His massive chest expanded, drawing in the ozone-tainted air, and he released a battle roar, a concussive wave of sound that registered at a bone-rattling 140 decibels. It was a sound engineered by evolution to shatter the nervous systems of lesser prey before the physical strike even landed. The sheer acoustic force of it made my own mandibles vibrate. The human jumped slightly, just a tiny, startled hop, the way one might react to a door slamming unexpectedly. Then, impossibly, she smiled. I scrutinized her facial micro-expressions. It was not a nervous smile. It was not a terrified grimace masquerading as a smile to appease a predator. It was an actual, genuine, brilliantly delighted smile. "Oh wow," she said, her eyes going wide with pure, unadulterated wonder as she stared up at the 8-foot engine of destruction looming over her. "Are you a Vexraxian? I have read so much about your species." She took a step forward, into his strike radius. "The exoskeleton structure is even more impressive in person," she continued, her voice practically vibrating with academic thrill. She leaned in, tilting her head to inspect the lethal, razor-edged crest that was currently signaling her imminent dismemberment. "Do you mind if I ask, is that a threat display or a greeting ritual?" She paused, tapping her data pad thoughtfully, "because I have seen conflicting information in the academic literature." The corridor plunged into a deafening silence. The atmospheric cyclers hummed. Kraragtha stopped mid-charge. The kinetic momentum of his massive frame halted so abruptly his claws gouged deep grooves into the reinforced deck plating. His bioluminescent crest, a violent, bloodthirsty red a second prior, flickered violently. It stuttered, dimmed, and then shifted into a deep, mottled shade of confused purple. I stood frozen. For the first time in 43 cycles, I felt my own perfectly honed combat instincts stuttering and throwing errors, like a critically damaged targeting processor trying to compute the impossible. The first mystery loop of the human species had just been violently ripped open before my eyes, and I had absolutely no idea how to close it. "Human," I said carefully, My voice cut through the heavy silence of the corridor, demanding order in a situation that defied tactical logic. That was a threat display. She blinked, her small, rounded ears twitching almost imperceptibly as she turned her attention back to me. The massive Vexian shock trooper remained frozen, his claws still buried in the floor plating, his crest a pulsing array of bewildered purple. He was preparing to engage you in lethal combat, I explained, enunciating each word as if speaking to a critically concussed recruit. I needed her to understand the proximity of her own death. I needed to see the survival instinct finally boot up behind those dangerously naive eyes. Those. That was it, a single, soft syllable of mild realization. She turned back to Kraragtha, completely unbothered, her apparently undiminished enthusiasm overriding any biological imperative to flee. "I am so sorry," she said, looking up at the towering engine of violence. "I did not mean to intrude on your training space. I am just lost." She adjusted her grip on her data pad, completely ignoring the razor-sharp talons resting less than half a meter from her vital organs. "My name is Emma Torres, xenobiology student, first year. Well, technically first week, first day actually," she offered a sheepish, disarming smile. "I arrived on station about 4 hours ago." Kraragtha looked at me. I looked at Kraragtha. We were a battle-hardened instructor and a Tier 1 shock trooper, two apex predators of the Galactic Military Institute, completely neutralized by a creature that weighed less than our standard-issue kinetic rifles. In that drawn-out second, amidst the fadding tactical stimulants and the clearing synthetic smoke, we shared a moment of profound, species-transcending bewilderment. The entire foundation of my psychological warfare training was fracturing. "You are lost," I repeated, the words feeling heavy and stupid in my mandibles. "Very lost," she confirmed cheerfully. "In a maximum security, military training facility." "Apparently, yes." I took a step closer, my secondary eyes locking onto her vital signs, searching for the physiological lie. There was none, and you are not concerned about this. She tilted her head, considering the question with the detached curiosity of a philosopher rather than prey. "Should I be?" she asked genuinely. "I mean, you all seem very professional. I am sure once I find the right department, everything will be fine." This, I would later reflect in the quiet, haunted hours of my command cycle, should have been my first real clue about the terrifying nature of humans. They do not process danger the way the rest of the galaxy does. It is not that they are blindly unafraid or biologically immune to terror. It is far more insidious. It is that their threat assessment system operates on some kind of catastrophic, delayed fuse mechanism. It is a psychological override that only activates after the dangerous situation has already occurred, often while they are standing knee-deep in the smoldering remains of what used to be the dangerous thing. "Come with me," I said. The command brooked no argument. The alternative was leaving her to wander blindly into a live-fire munitions testing bay or a zero-gravity combat theater, something that would actually permanently kill her. And despite my carefully cultivated reputation as a hardened, unyielding combat instructor, I am not actually comfortable with student casualties when I can physically prevent them. It was an ethical line I drew in the sand cycles ago. I turned on my heel and began marching toward the secure transit lifts. She followed me eagerly, practically bouncing on her feet as we walked through the brutalist corridors. The architecture here was deliberately designed to intimidate enemy combatants: harsh angles, low lighting, exposed industrial venting, yet she observed it like a tourist strolling through a botanical garden. "So what kind of training happens here?" she asked, breaking the tactical silence. She had wandered over to the reinforced, hyperglass windows that lined the corridor, peering eagerly into the various active simulation chambers. The glass was thick enough to contain the kinetic force of misplaced ordnance, but she pressed her unarmored face right against it. In the first chamber, a specialized squad of keel-tone commandos were deep into practicing zero-gravity breach tactics. The room was a chaotic storm of tether lines, simulated plasma fire, and rapid decompression drills. In the next chamber down, a team of Thraxian demolition specialists were frantically defusing volatile plasma mines while under a relentless barrage of simulated, heavy enemy fire. The deafening thuds of the training weapons vibrated through the floorboards. "Specialized combat scenarios," I said shortly, not slowing my pace. I wanted her out of the red zone immediately. "High-risk tactical operations." I paused, deciding to give her a dose of reality. "Survival rates during training are considered acceptable if they remain above 85%. "Wow," she breathed. Her eyes tracked a Thraxian specialist as he was violently thrown across the room by a concussive shockwave. She was fundamentally missing the part where I had just explicitly told her that 15% of the trainees who walk into these rooms do not survive to walk out. That must take incredible skill. My mandibles tightened. The doubt was creeping in, a heavy, cold certainty that this fragile creature was fundamentally broken. We passed Sector 4's primary medical wing. Inside, behind the blood-spattered viewing glass, our trauma surgeons were deep into conducting emergency mass casualty response drills. Through the window, Emma could clearly see the horror of battlefield medicine. She could see the simulated casualties screaming in synthetic agony, the high-pressure sprays of artificial blood painting the sterile walls, the chaotic, desperate intensity of military surgeons fighting a losing battle against time. It was a scene designed to test the psychological fortitude of field medics. She did not flinch. Instead, she stopped walking entirely. She leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging the transparent aluminum. "Is that a Quavian anatomy model?" she asked, pointing a small, fragile finger at the surgical table. "I did not realize their cardiovascular system was so decentralized. That is fascinating." The second mystery loop snapped into place. I was beginning to suspect something very specific and very dangerous about Emma Torres. "Miss Torres," I said, stopping in the middle of the corridor and turning my full, armored bulk to face her. "What exactly is your academic focus within xenobiology?" She turned away from the horrific surgical display. "Oh, extreme environment adaptation and trauma response mechanisms in sapient species." Her entire face lit up. It was a terrifying illumination, the kind of manic, obsessive enthusiasm normally reserved for highly intoxicating substances or deep religious experiences. "I am particularly interested in how different species have evolved to handle physical damage and extreme stress," she continued, completely oblivious to my mounting horror. "My thesis proposal is on comparative healing rates and pain tolerance across 20 different species categories." I closed my primary eyes, feeling the cold, clinical reality wash over me. Of course it was. Of course, the single human who had blindly wandered into the most lethal, highly restricted military training facility on the entire station was specifically, academically interested in studying how things survive getting horrifically hurt. Exactly 3 days after her initial, catastrophic wrong turn into the combat armory, Emma Torres miraculously appeared in my private office. This was not my standard lecture classroom situated in the outer rings. This was my heavily fortified command office, deeply embedded in the secure military wing of the station. It is a tactical bunker that strictly requires 3 separate, highly encrypted security clearances just to access the primary corridor. It is designed to physically and electronically repel elite espionage units. Yet somehow, she was standing directly in the threshold. She was precariously holding a towering stack of glowing data pads, her posture relaxed and entirely unbothered by the automated defense turrets mounted in the ceiling. Clipped to her collar, she was wearing what appeared to be low-level visitor credentials, a security badge that she absolutely, fundamentally should not have been able to obtain. "Instructor Kryn," she said brightly, her voice echoing off the acoustic dampeners. She offered a warm wave, behaving exactly as if we were old friends cheerfully meeting for a midday meal, rather than an unauthorized civilian actively breaching classified military security. "I hope I am not interrupting, but I have a proposal I wanted to discuss with you." I stared at her, my primary optical clusters narrowing in sheer, predatory disbelief. My heavy office door, a foot-thick slab of reinforced titanium, which absolutely should have been magnetically locked, stood wide open behind her. "How did you get in here?" I demanded, the low, kinetic rumble in my chest vibrating the metal desk. "Oh, Lieutenant Riscar let me through," she answered smoothly, completely immune to the lethal tension filling the room. "I mentioned I was here to see you about a research opportunity, and he seemed to think that was fine." A cold, homicidal stillness settled over my combat instincts. I made an immediate, permanent mental note to have Lieutenant Riscar violently retrained on basic outpost security protocols. I would correct his tactical failure, possibly by making him run the lethal jungle survival course on continuous loop until he fundamentally understood the baseline concept of visual credential verification. "What research opportunity?" I asked, my voice dangerously tight, speaking out loud despite my much better judgment. Emma stepped fully into the bunker. She set her stack of data pads down on my tactical map interface with the careful, reverent enthusiasm of someone proudly presenting a rare birthday gift. "I want to embed with your combat training unit as a researcher," she stated clearly. I laughed. It was not a polite, diplomatic chuckle to ease the tension. It was not a dismissive, arrogant snort. It was an actual, full-throated, deeply cynical laugh that violently echoed off the metal walls of my office. The sheer absurdity of the request caused my secondary mandibles to click rapidly in genuine, unsuppressed amusement. Emma Torres did not seem the least bit offended by the display of predatory mockery. She simply waited in the center of the room. Her small, unarmored hands were folded neatly in front of her, and that terrifyingly patient smile never once wavered from her face. "You want to embed," I repeated slowly, wiping the amusement from my voice once my vocal cords had fully recovered. "With an elite combat training unit. As a researcher, you, a first-week xenobiology student who cannot successfully navigate a standardized space station without blindly ending up in restricted, live-fire military zones." "Yes," she said simply, devoid of any irony. "Absolutely not," I snarled, leaning my bulk over the desk. "I brought a formal proposal." She tapped the topmost glowing data pad, pushing it an inch toward my claws. "Approved by the Xenobiology Department head, Professor Quentrix. She thinks it would be an excellent opportunity for cross-departmental collaboration. She noted the potential applications for medical research alone would be substantial." I snatched up the data pad. I read the encrypted digital signature. Then I read it again, my internal processors grinding in frustration. Professor Quentrix had indeed officially signed off on this sheer insanity. The eccentric Thexian academic was heavily notorious across the sector for her highly unconventional research methods, but this specific authorization exceeded even her usual catastrophic disregard for common sense. "The answer is still definitively no," I said, setting the data pad down with a heavy, final thud. "My training facility is not a controlled scientific laboratory. These are highly volatile, active combat scenarios loaded with real, physical danger. Students die here, Miss Torres. Highly experienced, heavily armored Tier 1 soldiers die here." I leaned closer, ensuring she felt the atmospheric pressure of my absolute refusal. "I will not be held logically or morally responsible for the gruesome death of a civilian academic who naively thinks battlefield trauma is a convenient research opportunity." "I would sign liability waivers," she countered instantly, not retreating a single millimeter. She offered complete, legally binding medical and legal releases. The military academy would not be held legally responsible for any potential injuries or fatalities. "How incredibly comforting," I sneered, the sarcasm dripping from my mandibles. "Instructor Kryn," she said. Her tone shifted abruptly. The blinding cheerfulness evaporated into the sterile air. Her voice suddenly took on a hard, resonant quality that I had absolutely not heard from her before. It was dead serious. It was razor-focused. "I'm not asking for permission to play soldier," she stated, her dark eyes locking onto my primary optics with unyielding force. "I am asking to observe exactly how different alien species biologically respond to heavily controlled stress environments. Your specific facility is literally the only place on this entire orbital station where I can effectively study real-time trauma response across multiple distinct species under perfectly comparable conditions. She tapped the pad again, her small finger hitting the glass hard. The resulting data would be statistically invaluable, not just for my own academic research, but for fundamentally improving emergency medical protocols across the entire galactic medical community. I stopped moving. I stopped analyzing her as a biological anomaly and studied her as a tactical variable. I really, truly looked at her for the very first time. She was incredibly young, probably in her early 20s in standard human years. Her clothes were highly practical but visibly worn at the seams, exactly the kind of austere attire impoverished students wore when they ruthlessly spent their limited station credits on data books instead of thermal fashion. Her eyes, however, were something else entirely. They were sharp, calculating, and dangerously intelligent. Buried beneath her fragile, unprotected human biology, there was something profound there that intimately reminded me of veteran, war-torn soldiers. It was a kind of absolute, unbreakable certainty in her own overarching purpose, a brutal resolve that defied all statistical logic. One week, I heard myself say, my vocal processors executed the command before my tactical reasoning could successfully abort it, and I immediately, deeply regretted the words. You may actively observe for exactly 1 week. Her jaw tightened in victory, but I raised a massive, clawed hand to stall her momentum. You will strictly stay in designated, shielded safe zones at all times. You will follow every single verbal and non-verbal instruction I give without question, and without a fraction of a millisecond of hesitation. And if at any point, for any reason, I decide you are a tactical liability to my squad, you leave immediately. Understood. Her bright smile returned, radiating an intensity that could have effortlessly powered a small orbital starship. Understood. Thank you, Instructor Kryn. You will not regret this. I already regretted it immensely. The very next morning, the sheer, undeniable cost of my lapse in judgment materialized in the staging area. Emma Torres arrived at Active Training Bay 5 at precisely 600 hours sharp. She was fully outfitted, wearing proper, heavy-duty observation gear that swallowed her small frame, and she was carrying enough advanced sensory and recording equipment to fully document a small planetary war. The elite soldiers, who were already assembled in tight formation for brutal morning drills, openly stared at her. Their hardened expressions ranged wildly from deep tactical confusion to outright territorial hostility, and in the specific case of the massive Vexian, Kraragtha, a strange kind of resigned, exhausted acceptance. Attention, I called out, my voice cracking through the bay like a kinetic whip. The entire squad snapped into rigid, breathless formation. We have a civilian observer for the next week. Miss Torres is conducting academic research on combat stress responses. You will completely ignore her physical presence and seamlessly continue your training as normal. Grexix, a massive, heavily plated Tholian heavy weapons specialist, broke rank slightly, his voice a low, grinding rumble of armor plates. Sir, he rumbled, is it tactically wise to have a highly fragile species standing in an active live-fire training zone? She will remain securely locked in the elevated observation gallery behind reinforced energy barriers, I assured him sharply, daring anyone else to question the mandate. Before I could officially dismiss the squad to the armory, Emma unexpectedly raised her unarmored hand in the air, exactly like an obedient school child asking for ration permission. Yes, I said wearily, feeling a severe kinetic migraine forming behind my optical cluster. Will I be able to formally conduct interviews after the active training sessions conclude? She asked the silent room, entirely unfazed by the 30 sets of predatory eyes locked onto her. Brief ones, just a few scientific questions about your physiological responses and post-combat recovery protocols. The battle-hardened soldiers exchanged wary, deeply unreadable glances. If they explicitly volunteer, I stated firmly, establishing an unbreakable boundary. No one in this unit is formally required to participate in your research. What my advanced tactical probability models utterly failed to anticipate was just how many of these lethal killers would actually voluntarily submit to her probing. By the third exhaustive day of her in bed, the fragile hope of her project had solidified into staggering, undeniable data. Emma had successfully conducted deep-dive physiological interviews with over 30 different hardened soldiers, spanning 12 distinct, highly aggressive species architectures. She sat fearlessly in the active medical bay, asking deeply invasive biological questions while our frantic trauma specialists actively treated gruesome, simulated training injuries. She silently observed grueling meditation and deep tissue recovery sessions. She watched, completely unblinking, as these elite soldiers deliberately pushed themselves miles past what should have been terminal breaking points, only to quickly stitch themselves up and stagger back for more. And she ruthlessly, systematically took precise notes on everything. The Vrexian adrenal system is absolutely remarkable, she told me late on the fourth day. She was visibly exhausted, but her eyes were burning brilliantly with pure scientific fascination. Craraktha's internal stress hormone levels reliably spiked to concentrations that would be instantly lethal in most carbon-based species, but his secondary cardiac system aggressively compensates by rapidly redistributing heavily oxygenated blood directly to his critical organs. It is exactly like watching a highly tuned biological engine violently shift gears under extreme load. That is highly classified biological military data, I pointed out, staring in mild horror at the forbidden metrics scrolling smoothly across her worn pad. Craraktha voluntarily offered to wear the biomonitor, she replied smoothly, entirely unfazed. She said he seemed genuinely excited to contribute to the academic research. She glanced down at her screen. He said, and I quote directly, "Tiny human asks good questions, makes warrior think about warriorness." I slowly rubbed my mandibles, feeling the psychological foundation of my elite unit subtly, irreversibly altering. I made a firm tactical note to interrogate Craraktha immediately regarding his sudden, highly uncharacteristic philosophical tendencies. The resolve was paying off. The data was flowing, but the tactical environment remained a tightly coiled spring, and the fragile human was standing entirely too close to the firing mechanism. On the fifth day of her in bed, the fragile academic equilibrium we had carefully constructed finally, violently shattered. We were actively running a Tier 1 hostage extraction scenario. It was a high-difficulty operational parameters test, utilizing live ammunition stun rounds and active, shifting environmental hazards designed to push elite operatives to their psychological limits. The training team on the main floor consisted of our absolute best, a highly lethal, mixed-species unit that had been seamlessly working together for months without a single tactical failure. Up in the shielded observation gallery, securely locked behind 3 inches of reinforced hyperglass, Emma Torres sat exactly where I had ordered her. She was closely surrounded by glowing biomonitors, actively tracking the physiological telemetry of 6 different team members, her worn data pad rapidly recording every microfluctuation. The highly complex scenario was going well. From my elevated command console, I watched the veteran squad execute a flawless, synchronized breach-and-clear maneuver through the kill house. It was going too well, perhaps, moving with a clinical precision that bordered on dangerous complacency. I reached for the primary haptic console to manually inject a severe tactical complication into the simulation. But before my armored claw could even graze the interface, the station's environmental system violently glitched. This was absolutely not a planned difficulty increase initiated from the secure command deck. It was a sudden, catastrophic, systemic malfunction deep within the station's tertiary life support architecture. The massive atmospheric processors mounted high in the ceiling of the training bay shrieked, the sound of grinding metal echoing horribly through the comms channel. Then they suddenly started flooding the completely sealed room with heavy, chemical smoke. This was not the standard, inert synthetic fog we routinely used for visual obfuscation during basic drills. It was incredibly heavy, completely dense, and deeply, immediately toxic. I watched the squad's telemetry data on my secondary screen instantly spike from elevated exertion into critical red hazard zones. Automated emergency protocols were deeply hardwired into the bay's foundational architecture. They absolutely should have activated immediately upon detecting the lethal compounds. They were designed to forcibly clear the toxic air through rapid decompression and automatically, safely end the simulation. They did not. The hazard sirens remained completely dead. The massive blast doors, designed to quarantine chemical spills, magnetically sealed shut with a deafening, final thud. I was already moving, my deep tactical mandate entirely overriding my temporary shock. I was screaming emergency, override orders into the primary comms channel, my heavy fists violently hammering the physical, manual release buttons on the control console. Down in the sealed bay, the veteran soldiers recognized the immediate shift from a controlled simulation to a lethal reality instantly. They were extensively trained for this exact kind of catastrophic environmental failure, immediately abandoning the primary objective and moving aggressively toward the emergency bulkheads, even as the caustic smoke rapidly thickened around them. But the heavy, synthetic hostage dummies were still tightly secured in the dead center of the simulated kill house. The squad's designated team leader was a young, highly decorated Keelan named Praxis. Keelans are biologically and psychologically bred for absolute mission fidelity. As the rest of the squad fell back to survive, Praxis hesitated for just a fraction of a second, his deeply ingrained tactical training violently warring with his basic biological instinct to abandon the primary mission. That single, microscopic moment of hesitation was the fatal fracture in the timeline. It explicitly meant he inhaled a massive lungful of the heavy, toxic smoke. For a Keelan, whose respiratory system is highly hyper-efficient at oxygen exchange, the corrosive gas acted exactly like inhaled liquid fire. Praxis convulsed violently, his heavy kinetic weapon clattering uselessly to the deck plating. He went down hard, his heavy armor crashing against the steel floor with a sickening resonance. The flawless tactical cohesion of the elite unit instantly dissolved into desperate, uncoordinated chaos. The other soldiers were frantically scrambling in the dark, trying desperately to reverse course and reach their fallen commander. But the chemical smoke was far too incredibly thick now. Visual telemetry was failing across all suits. Physical visibility inside the sealed bay violently dropped down to almost absolute nothing. Through the open, unencrypted comms channels, I could hear the horrifying, intimate sounds of elite Tier 1 soldiers actively breaking down. I could clearly hear them violently coughing, their voices heavily muffled and deeply disoriented as the severe neurotoxins began to aggressively strip away their spatial awareness. I was uselessly locked behind the impenetrable glass, violently punching dead failsafes, forced to watch my absolute best squad slowly suffocating in the dark. And then, sharply cutting through the intense static and the sickening choking gasps, I heard something that made the hyperoxygenated blood in my veins run completely cold. It was the distinct, pressurized mechanical hiss of the secure observation gallery door being manually opened. I whipped my massive head around. "Tors, no," I roared, the sheer, concussive volume of my voice rattling the acoustic dampeners in the command booth. She did not stop. The thermal imaging cameras mounted on the ceiling caught what my primary eyes completely refused to logically believe. Emma Tors, possessing all 5 feet of an untrained, highly fragile civilian human biology, deliberately bypassed the safety rails and dropped directly into that lethal, smoke-filled training bay. She had 0 tactical armor. She possessed no internal respiratory filtration systems. She was wearing absolutely nothing to protect her fragile lungs but a torn piece of her own standard-issue shirt, tightly wrapped around her lower face as a pathetic, deeply inadequate makeshift filter. It was a complete, irrational collapse of basic biological survival protocol. I watched in paralyzed horror on the few still functioning thermal monitors as she hit the deck plating. She didn't freeze in panic. She didn't cower from the corrosive heat. She moved aggressively through the blinding, chemical smoke with a terrifying speed and a calculated precision that made absolutely no logical sense for a creature of her severe physiological limitations. Her thermal bloom cut cleanly through the toxic haze. She effortlessly bypassed 3 heavily armored soldiers who were blindly stumbling in the dark. Her internal compass somehow locked perfectly onto the fallen squad leader. She reached Praxis first. The massive Keelan was completely unresponsive, his huge frame spasming as his lungs chemically burned. Emma didn't hesitate to assess the impossible physics of the situation. She grabbed the massive, heavily armored soldier tightly under the arms, locked her fragile human hands together across his heavy chest plate, and aggressively started dragging his dead weight backward toward the nearest viable emergency exit. He was fully geared in dense combat armor. He easily outweighed her frail human form by at least 100 pounds. The severe friction coefficient of dragging that much dead mass across industrial steel grating should have immediately snapped the tendons in her arms and permanently shattered her lower spine. But she moved him anyway. Her small legs were churning violently against the floorboards, finding impossible purchase where there was none. Her whole body was entirely, violently committed to the massive kinetic motion, turning her fragile skeletal structure into a living, biological winch. Out of the blinding, toxic haze, a towering Corran soldier suddenly loomed, totally disoriented and stumbling wildly off balance. He was a 2-ton biological tank, thrashing blindly directly in her critical path. Emma didn't flinch or retreat. She seamlessly released one hand from Praxis's heavy harness and redirected the panicked Corran with a perfectly angled, violent shove exactly toward the glowing emergency exit markers. She never once stopped her grueling, agonizing backward drag of Praxis. Through the glass, I could see the torn fabric of her makeshift mask rapidly deteriorating from the caustic air, sealing her permanent physical fracture. The toxic chemical smoke did not simply obscure vision, it fundamentally aggressively attacked cellular cohesion. Down in the blinding, heavily saturated darkness of Training Bay 5, the sheer atmospheric density of the lethal compound was actively dissolving the synthetic fibers of Emma Tor's makeshift respiratory filter. She was operating on a strictly borrowed, rapidly expiring timeline. From the elevated, heavily shielded command bunker, my primary optical sensors tracked her terrifyingly fragile thermal bloom as she ruthlessly dragged the massive, heavily armored form of the fallen Keelan squad leader, Praxis, directly through the caustic haze. The brutal physics of the extraction were fundamentally impossible. Praxis was a Tier 1 combat operative, outfitted in deep space kinetic armor plating. He explicitly outweighed her frail human biology by at least 100 pounds. The sheer kinetic friction of dragging that much dead, unresponsive mass across industrial steel floor grating should have violently dislocated her shoulders and permanently snapped the fragile tendons in her unarmored arms. She forcefully moved him anyway. Her small, unarmored legs were churning violently against the scorched deck plating, her combat boots slipping frantically on the slick, chemical residue. Her entire fragile physiological structure was absolutely, completely committed to the brutal backward motion. She had turned her skeletal framework into a biological winch, utilizing leverage and sheer, irrational willpower to completely override the catastrophic failure of her own burning musculature. Suddenly, a towering Corran shock soldier abruptly loomed directly out of the dense, corrosive smoke. He was severely disoriented, violently stumbling off balance as the neurotoxins ravaged his central nervous system. He was a 2-ton biological juggernaut thrashing blindly in her immediate, critical escape path. Emma did not freeze in terror, nor did she retreat. Without violently breaking her agonizing momentum, she smoothly released one hand from Praxis's heavy tactical harness. She aggressively redirected the panicked, massive Corran soldier with a perfectly angled, violent shove exactly toward the glowing emergency exit markers. She never once halted her grueling, agonizing backward drag of the dying Keelan. The human was explicitly paying a permanent biological cost for every single inch of ground she gained. I could clearly see the exact moment her makeshift fabric mask finally failed, allowing the highly caustic environmental gas to directly enter her unprotected lungs. Her thermal signature spiked violently as severe internal tissue inflammation instantly set in. Yet, the brutal, backward rhythm of her drag did not slow. The second major mystery loop of her species, their bizarre, deeply delayed threat assessment, was violently snapping shut in my mind. It was not a delay in processing fear. It was a complete, hardwired biological override. When confronted with the imminent death of an ally, the human empathy response violently bypassed their own foundational survival instincts. With a concussive, deeply resonant thud that shook the entire station quadrant, the heavy emergency atmospheric systems finally, aggressively kicked in. Massive, industrial-grade ventilation turbines mounted in the bulkhead walls roared violently to life. They created a massive negative pressure vacuum, rapidly and aggressively sucking the thick, highly toxic chemical smoke out of the sealed training bay in violent, swirling cyclones. The heavy titanium blast doors magnetically disengaged and violently retracted. Heavily armored medical triage teams, outfitted in full biohazard containment suits, desperately rushed into the chaotic clearing. I breached the command bunker doors and hit the ground floor running, my massive talons tearing gouges into the deck plating. Through the rapidly dissipating grey haze, I finally found her. Emma Torres sat heavily on the scorched steel floor, directly next to the massive, heavily armored bulk of the unresponsive Praxis. Her fragile chest was heaving erratically. She was coughing violently, hacking up caustic fluids as her severely damaged lungs desperately fought for clean oxygen. Her dark eyes were heavily streaming with tears from the intense chemical burns, and her ruined, highly inadequate makeshift fabric mask lay casually discarded on the deck beside her. I dropped my massive frame to the floor, my heavy armor grinding against the steel as I kneeled closely beside her. The air still reeked of highly volatile toxins and ozone. "You idiot," I said, my voice heavily distorted by raw, unsuppressed panic and a deep, terrifying awe. "You absolute reckless idiot." She slowly looked up at me. Her face was heavily smeared with toxic soot and the viscous, green training gel from the soldier's armor. She was still violently coughing, her frail body shaking with the severe physiological trauma of the exposure. And yet, impossibly, she somehow managed to form a brilliant, genuine smile. "He was going to die," she wheezed, her voice a ragged, broken rasp that sounded like crushed glass. "Could not let that happen." She drew in a shallow, agonizing breath, her ribcage struggling against the internal damage. "Not on my watch." The sheer, staggering audacity of the statement temporarily short-circuited my vocal processors. "Your watch," I repeated, the deep, kinetic rumble in my chest vibrating with absolute disbelief. "You are a civilian researcher. You are an academic observer." I pointed a massive, clawed digit directly at the shattered safety glass of the elevated gallery. "You had exactly one job: stay securely in the designated safe zone." She leaned her head back against the cold steel bulkhead, her breathing heavily labored but slowly stabilizing as the station's atmospheric cyclers pumped pure oxygen into the bay. "People were hurt," she said simply. She delivered the phrase as if it were a fundamental law of universal physics, as if those three simple words adequately, completely explained the total abandonment of all logical self-preservation. And perhaps, for the deeply psychotic architecture of the human brain, it actually did. The immediate, chaotic aftermath of the catastrophic breach was a blur of flashing medical strobes and frantic, shouted tactical orders. Praxis, along with the other elite soldiers who had been severely affected by the dense toxic smoke, were rapidly evacuated to the primary medical wing. Because of her completely irrational, suicidal intervention, they all miraculously survived the initial exposure and praised fully. The subsequent, highly aggressive internal military investigation ruthlessly tore through the station's logistics logs. The deep dive audit ultimately revealed that the catastrophic environmental malfunction was directly due to a severe, localized maintenance oversight. This critical failure in the automated subroutines quickly resulted in several senior engineering technicians being permanently reassigned to far less critical, highly menial duties on the station's outer rings. The cold, unforgiving military bureaucracy, however, still demanded its absolute pound of flesh. Emma Torres was formally, officially reprimanded by the command structure for blatantly, violently violating strict operational safety protocols. Her civilian file was permanently marked with a severe tactical insubordination charge. Simultaneously, recognizing the sheer, undeniable reality that she had single-handedly saved the life of a highly decorated Tier 1 operative, she was quietly, off the books, offered a prestigious, high-level commendation by the overall station commander. In a final, utterly baffling act of psychological defiance, the small human politely, firmly declined the military honor. She filed the rejection paperwork on the specific, explicit grounds that she had strictly only done exactly what anyone else would inherently do in that specific situation. It was a staggering, deeply terrifying lie. No one else in the entire galaxy would have dropped into that toxic hellscape. Only a human, only her. 3 operational cycles later, on her final, officially sanctioned day of academic observation, I deliberately called her back to my highly secure command office. The heavy titanium blast doors sealed shut behind her. "You have officially completed your 1 week," I said, my voice echoing off the dampeners. The heavy titanium blast doors of my secure command office sealed shut, cutting off the relentless, industrial thrum of the station's primary corridors. On her final day of authorized observation, I had deliberately called her back to this heavily fortified bunker. The physical consequences of the training bay disaster were permanently etched into her biology. Emma Torres sat quietly across from my massive desk, the harsh, sterile overhead lighting casting sharp shadows across the new, pale dermal scarring along her jawline. The aggressive chemical burns from the toxic smoke had healed, but they had left a permanent, visual receipt of her irrational sacrifice. When she inhaled deeply, there was a faint, lingering wheeze in her chest, a microfracture in her respiratory architecture that our advanced medical autodocs could not completely erase. She had permanently traded a fraction of her own lung capacity for the continued existence of a Keelan strike team leader. "You have completed your week," I said, my voice low, dropping the harsh, commanding cadence of the active training floor. "Your research data has been officially logged, decrypted, and formally approved for academic use," I continued, watching her small hands fold neatly in her lap. "Professor Quentrix is apparently thrilled with your preliminary findings." The eccentric Thexian academic had virtually flooded my secure comms channels with frantic, encrypted praise for the unprecedented physiological telemetry Emma had violently extracted from the jaws of a lethal malfunction. "It has been an incredible experience," Emma said, her voice carrying that same, fundamentally unbreakable warmth. "Thank you for allowing me to participate." I leaned back heavily in my reinforced command chair, the deep kinetic dampeners groaning under my armored mass. I was studying her one last time, desperately trying to map the terrifying psychology buried behind her fragile human eyes. "The soldiers have been talking," I said slowly, letting the silence stretch. "They have been talking about the civilian human who deliberately runs into extreme danger instead of away from it." I tapped a heavy, clawed digit against the steel desk. "Who asks highly invasive academic questions about biological pain tolerance while sitting casually next to heavily armored soldiers being actively treated for actual, gruesome combat injuries. Who treats a lethal, toxic smoke incident like a minor scheduling inconvenience." She blinked, her brow furrowing slightly. She actually looked genuinely confused by the assessment. "I did not mean to cause any disruptions," she offered apologetically, entirely missing the profound, seismic shift she had triggered within the institute. "You did not cause disruptions," I said, my mandibles clicking in absolute rigid certainty. "You caused something far more dangerous. You caused respect. In Trauma Response Unit 7, respect is not freely given. It is violently extracted. It is a lethal, heavy currency forged strictly in the fires of mutual survival. For an elite, multi-species combat squad to collectively bestow that profound level of reverence upon a fragile, unarmored civilian was a fundamental fracturing of our established military doctrine." I reached across the dark metal of my desk and smoothly slid a highly encrypted, glowing data pad across the surface toward her. "This is a formal, heavily vetted application for the military's civilian specialist program," I stated, watching her eyes lock onto the blue light. "It would explicitly allow you to continue your advanced research here permanently, operating as a fully embedded academic consultant." Her breath hitched, the faint wheeze catching in the silent room. "You would have unrestricted, top-tier clearance access to all live-fire training scenarios highly classified medical trauma data, and direct, unfiltered personnel interviews, I explained, mapping the operational parameters. I leaned my massive frame forward, casting a deep shadow over her. You would also be strictly required to undergo basic, rigorous tactical safety training, because I absolutely will not have you dying stupidly in my corridors before your vital research is complete. She stared down at the glowing data pad like I had just physically handed her the operational keys to the entire galaxy. Her small fingers hovered inches above the biometric scanner. "Are you serious?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly under the crushing weight of the sudden revelation. "Regrettably, yes," I rumbled. I allowed myself a very small, entirely rare predatory smile. "Against all tactical logic, mathematical probability, and basic common sense, you have successfully convinced some of the most highly dangerous, lethal soldiers in the entire galaxy that a tiny, fragile human with absolutely no combat training and highly questionable navigational skills is explicitly worth listening to." I tapped the desk once, a final, resonant sound. "That is a psychological skill set I absolutely cannot afford to ignore." Emma Torres picked up the heavy data pad. I could clearly see her unarmored hands visibly trembling with the adrenaline of the moment. "I accept," she said immediately, her thumb slamming down onto the biometric sensor before the digital ink was even fully rendered. "You have not even read the operational terms," I warned her, my secondary eyes narrowing at her reckless velocity. "Do not care," she replied, her dark eyes locking onto mine with that terrifying absolute certainty. "I accept." That monumental, timeline-altering fracture in our protocol was exactly 3 cycles ago. Emma Torres is still here on Station Kronos 9. She is still relentlessly asking her invasive, brilliant questions. She is still inexplicably appearing in highly restricted, deeply dangerous places she absolutely should not be, navigating the brutalist architecture with that exact same, terrifyingly cheerful disregard for appropriate tactical caution. The structural aftermath of her presence is undeniable. She has officially, rigorously published 7 groundbreaking academic papers heavily detailing multi-species combat stress responses. She didn't just record the data, she weaponized it for survival. She has personally designed and implemented advanced, highly efficient frontline medical protocols that have demonstrably saved hundreds of elite lives across 3 separate, massive military branches. And yet the biological anomaly persists. She has, on 4 entirely separate, deeply chaotic occasions, somehow ended up trapped deep inside active, live-fire combat zones. It is always through a bizarre, impossible combination of logistical accidents and what I can only logically assume is the universe's deeply twisted sense of humor. Yet she has never once failed to walk back out of the fire. The hardened, lethal soldiers of Sector 4 do not call her Observer anymore. They call her Doc now, even though she's strictly an academic researcher and not a licensed medical doctor. In the bloody, unforgiving trenches of the Galactic Military Institute, it is a heavy term of deep affection. It is a profound, unbreakable mark of absolute respect. It is their silent, collective acknowledgement that she is fundamentally one of them in the only ways that actually matter. The true meaning of her existence here, however, was cemented for me just last week. At precisely 300 hours during the dead shift, when the station's ambient hum drops to a low, mournful frequency, I found her sitting alone in the primary medical bay. She was sitting in the dim, blue emergency lighting with a massive, heavily plated young recruit. He had just violently, permanently washed out of the Tier 1 shock trooper program, and his colossal frame was hunched over, utterly devastated by the psychological crushing weight of his ultimate failure. Emma was not holding her worn data pad. She was not taking academic notes, nor was she coldly recording his physiological trauma data for a thesis. She was just sitting there on the cold steel bench next to him, speaking quietly into the dark. She was patiently, gently reminding a broken weapon of war that a severe failure in one specific path absolutely does not mean a terminal failure in all paths. That exact recruit formally reapplied to a highly specialized, different logistical program 2 days later. He is actively thriving now. This is the terrifying, inescapable truth I have ultimately learned about humans and specifically about this singular, impossible human. They do not internally process danger the way the rest of the biological galaxy does. They process purpose. And if their deep, internal purpose explicitly tells them to run aggressively toward the blazing fire instead of logically fleeing away from it, they will do so. They will charge into the suffocating dark with a genuine smile on their face and absolutely zero biological hesitation. It is deeply terrifying. It is fundamentally, mathematically illogical. It is completely, irreversibly insane by every single reasonable tactical standard in the known universe. And it is also, perhaps, the exact, profound reason why the fragile human species might just ultimately survive in this cold, hyperlethal galaxy. After all, the historical record will permanently show that Emma Torres simply walked blindly into the wrong classroom on her very first day. She stumbled naively into a meat grinder, completely stripped of armor, fangs, or kinetic weaponry. Yet she ended up in exactly the right place anyway. Because sometimes, the absolute most dangerous, timeline-altering thing in the entire galaxy is not the heavy plasma weapon, the genetically engineered soldier, or the impenetrable training facility. Sometimes, it is just the small, fragile human who looks directly at lethal danger, smiles warmly, and politely asks if it would mind answering a few quick questions for science.